Hi, I'm Alison McCall and I'd like to thank you for asking me to talk today. Gallery 14 in the Art Gallery is subtitled The Gallery of Empowerment. It showcases one of Britain's most significant collections of suffragette correspondence, the Watt collection. Many suffragettes routinely destroyed all their correspondence for fear of police raids, but one suffragette in Aberdeen, Caroline Phillips, kept hers. This collection was donated to the Art Gallery by a relative on her mother's side, whose surname was Watt, hence the Watt collection. Professor Sarah Pedersen of Robert Gordon University has written this book on Caroline Phillips, and so I'm only going to give you an outline of her life as all the information is in this book. Caroline Phillips was born in Kintore. Both parents were teachers. Her father was headmaster of the Free Church School there, and her mother was a part-time sewing teacher. We know that her mother was working, and yet, as we can see here, in the 1871 census, only her father's occupation is recorded. The under-recording of women's work is one of the challenges of women's history. The family moved to Aberdeen when Caroline was 5, when her father became head teacher of the boys' department of St Paul Street School. At the time, teachers were paid a payment by results bonus. The girls' department were outperforming the boys, and so the headmistress of the girls' department earned more than the headmaster of the boys. This couldn't have been much fun for Mr Phillips, but it did mean that Caroline had a role model of a successful professional woman. Caroline became a journalist with Aberdeen Journals, and some of the letters in the Watt collection are written on Aberdeen Journals' headed paper. As secretary of the Aberdeen branch of the Women's Social and Political Union, the WSPU, she corresponded with many of the big names of the suffragette movement. Visit Gallery 14 and see what names you can spot. Today, I'm not going to talk about the big names, but I'm going to talk solely about women in Aberdeen. One of the most evocative items in the gallery is the suffragette tea set. Social networking was an extremely important aspect of women's activism. It's a truism to say that during the Victorian era, women and men occupied separate spheres. It's a term you may have heard before. Men occupied the public sphere and women the private sphere. However, in practice, women's private sphere included activities which we would now think of as being in the public sphere. Political meetings held at home over a cup of tea could fall within the private sphere. Women in Aberdeen had been politically active for decades prior to the suffragettes. There was an Aberdeen Female Chartist Society in the 1830s, led by Mrs Isabella Legg. Women in Aberdeen had campaigned against the slave trade, they had campaigned for university education for women and for better pensions for female teachers. They had campaigned against vivisection, against the Contagious Diseases Acts, which created a system of licensed prostitution for the benefit of the armed forces, and against the Boer War. And much of this political activity happened in the private sphere, with fundraisers and petition signing in private homes over a cup of tea and a fine piece. Women had also been active on committees for soup kitchens, or education for blind children, or provision for orphans, or the home in King Street for fallen women. From the 1850s on, the Aberdeen Women's Sanitary Association had lent out cleaning materials, such as buckets and brushes, and sold lime wash and soap at cost price to families who could not have afforded them otherwise. And because soup, or children, or cleaning were seen as women's issues, these committees, even those handling quite large budgets, fell within the private sphere, because nothing says women quite like a scrubbing brush and a bucket of soapy water. Aberdeen Art Gallery has a fine collection of paintings by Aberdeen-born artist William Dyce. Dyce was part of Prime Minister Gladstone's project to rescue prostitutes. Dyce employed one of Gladstone's rescued women, Marion Summerhays, as the model for this painting, Beatrice. Griffin Coe, Curator of Art here in Aberdeen, had an article on this painting in The Guardian in May. What is less well known is that Dyce's female relatives also supported Gladstone's project, both financially and practically, but much of their work went under the radar as it fell within the sort of caring work that women were expected to do. Gallery 14, the Gallery of Empowerment, reflects on the point at which women's political activism in Aberdeen stopped happening under the radar and stopped being disguised as private sphere activity. This tea set, I love this tea set. This reflects the point at which women are drawing upon decades of experience of organising and networking and pushing forward. If you haven't looked at it properly before, visit Gallery 14. So, who would have sat around a tea table set with a suffragette tea set in Aberdeen? Some of the correspondence in the Watt collection is with Agnes Ramsay, later Lady Agnes Ramsay, wife of Professor Sir William Ramsay, who was a Professor of Humanity at the University of Aberdeen. The Ramsays travelled widely in connection with Professor Ramsay's research. Agnes Ramsay wrote 2 travel books, Everyday Life in Turkey, published in 1897 and most recently republished in 2011, and The Romance of Elizabeth, published in 1899. Perhaps Lady Ramsay's daughter, also Agnes, might have accompanied her mother to suffragette meetings. Agnes Jr. was born during one of her parents' expeditions in Turkey. She graduated from Aberdeen University in 1904 and became a lecturer. She served with St John's Ambulance in France during the First World War. The Watt Archive letters refer to a Miss Ogston. This could be one of 2 suffragette sisters, Helen and Constance, also connected socially to the Ramsays through Aberdeen University, where their father was Professor of Surgery from 1882. Both sisters are likely to have attended their fair share of suffragette tea parties. Helen is the better known of the 2, having disrupted a meeting addressed by Lloyd George at the Albert Hall in 1908. When stewards tried to throw her out of the meeting, she defended herself with a dog whip. Some of Phillips' correspondence was with Mrs Annie Allen, 67 Forest Avenue, Aberdeen. Annie Forbes Russell came from a fishing family. She married John Allen, an organist and music teacher, in 1895, and they had at least one child, Dorothy. Another correspondent was Miss Annie McRobbie of Rosemount Terrace, who found herself in the unenviable position of the youngest daughter to whom had fallen the care of her elderly widowed mother. Annie McRobbie supported herself and her mother by working as a bookkeeper. Although there is a popular belief that most women of the time were not in paid work, for women like Annie McRobbie, who was supporting an elderly widowed parent, there was no option other than to be the breadwinner of the household. Another correspondent was Mrs Black, a widow from Forest Avenue, who combined campaigning for the vote with campaigning for temperance. She continued to support the temperance cause long after the vote was won. Another letter was from Dr Anne Mercer Watson, confirming the support of herself and her colleague Dr Laura Sandeman for suffrage. These 2 women were both GPs in Aberdeen. Dr Sandeman subsequently served with the Scottish Women's Hospitals in France during the First World War. We know from these letters the core supporters of female suffrage in Aberdeen, but who else might have supported the cause? It is at this point that we realise the value of social networks and tea parties. Lady Agnes Ramsay was very well connected with other academic families. She was not the only woman from Aberdeen to have travelled. The Ramsays would have known the Pirrie family. William R. Pirrie was Professor of Divinity at Aberdeen. His daughter Annie, later Annie Quibell, became an Egyptologist. We know that she wouldn't have been at the suffragette tea parties because she was working in Egypt from 1895 on. A second Egyptologist, Nora MacDonald, worked as a conservator at Aberdeen University's Archaeological Museum from 1901 to 1907, when she married Francis Llewellyn Griffiths and left Aberdeen, spending much of her life thereafter working in Egypt. I'm not going to say more about Aberdeen's Egyptologists because I'm not an expert. Aberdeen's expert on them is Amy Thompson. Lady Ramsay's husband William was educated at the gymnasium in Old Aberdeen, taught by Govey Anderson. This is another social connection for these women. Govey Anderson's daughter, Mary, was one of the 7 women who campaigned to study medicine at Edinburgh University in 1869. She finally graduated as a doctor in 1879, graduating from the University of France, Paris. Her brother, James Anderson, married Dr Elizabeth Garrett, better known as Dr Elizabeth Garrett Anderson. The Andersons were, of course, a generation earlier than the suffragettes, but the Anderson legacy lived on. Govey's great-granddaughter, Inez Ferguson, was born at Hilton House, Aberdeen. She studied at St Hilda's College, Oxford, and became active in the suffrage movement, although she was a member of a more moderate group, the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies. She was press secretary for the NUWSS in 1917 and subsequently held other posts. Aberdeen Women's Alliance created a series of information boards in Stuart Park, and one of them includes information on Inez Ferguson. The Trails were another university family who supported suffrage, Mrs. Catherine Trail having addressed students at the university in favour of suffrage in 1905. Now you are probably thinking that the interlinked group of women who knew each other socially and supported women's education and women's suffrage I've described so far were all linked to Aberdeen University. However, there were other social groupings in Aberdeen. One of these was the Women's Liberal Society, who favoured peaceful campaigning for the vote. Chief amongst these women were the Esselmonts, Clementina Esselmont, wife of MP George Burney Esselmont, and their daughter, Dr. Mary Esselmont. Other women in this social grouping included Clementina's school friends, poet and translator Bessie Craigmile, and Elizabeth Barnett, who published pamphlets on a wide range of social issues. Elizabeth Barnett's daughters, Elizabeth Barnett Jr., Aberdeen's first female solicitor, and botanist Dr. Euphemia Barnett were school friends of Mary Esselmont. Also in this group was one woman whose picture can be spotted in various locations in the art gallery. She wasn't an artist, and there's nothing written about her in the art gallery so far as I can see, but here she is, novelist Nan Shepherd, who appears on the £5 note in the art gallery's collection boxes. Other Liberal families were the Crombies and the Paytons. Minna Wason was the daughter of an MP, and she married John William Crombie of the Crombie-Coates family. John William Crombie became Liberal MP for Kincardineshire in 1892. Mrs. Crombie was involved in various good works associated with her husband's political career. Their daughter Fenella was also interested in politics. She married John Payton of Granham. She and her mother funded Aberdeen's first birth control clinic in 1926. Aberdeen Art Gallery has a splendid portrait of Mrs. Crombie, painted by John Singer Sargent. I don't think this portrait is currently on display, but it would fit into Gallery 14 beautifully. The Art Gallery is lucky in that when it comes to Gallery 14, it is spoiled for choice. Linked to the Women's Liberal Society were two aristocratic proponents of female suffrage, Lady Aberdeen and Lady Cowdray. Lady Cowdray is of course familiar to all those who love the Art Gallery as the donor of the Cowdray Hall. In 1911, Lady Cowdray entertained Mrs. Pankhurst at a huge social gathering at Dinecht House. 1,000 people were invited. Presumably she didn't have a suffragette tea set big enough to serve them all. But again it shows that personal relationships and social networking was important to female activism. The guest list included Caroline Phillips, Sir and Lady Ramsay, the Esselmonts, Miss Black, Sir David and Lady Stewart being one of the artist William Dyce's nieces, the Trails, Dr. Anne Mercer Watson, a further demonstration of the cohesive nature of Aberdeen society. I'm going to move on to another item in Gallery 14, the portrait of Mrs. Strachan. She isn't given her own name, but she was born Elsie Isabel Cromer, the daughter of an Aberdeen dentist, in 1874. She won prizes for essays on religious topics such as The Life of Abraham in 1891 and The Life of St. Peter in 1892. And in 1893 she passed a course in public nursing. She appears to have been living out with Scotland in the 1901 census. She may have been doing something interesting, but I haven't been able to find out. She married the artist Douglas Strachan. The painting is supposed to reflect her pale, delicate femininity, but she had a nursing qualification, so I suspect she wasn't that delicate. The description states that the painting shows her in a domestic setting, reflecting the idea that her place was in the home. But as we have seen, women could combine being in the home with politics. Also in Gallery 14 is this portrait of Mrs. Ogilvie. Again, she has no name. She was Mary Isabel Duffus, whose father, Alexander Duffus, was a lawyer, part of the family firm Wilson and Duffus. She was the second wife of James T. Ogilvie, whose first wife had died, aged 28, 10 weeks after the birth of their second child. As a girl, she attended the same dance classes as Mary Esselmont, later Dr. Mary Esselmont, and Coral Gordon, the daughter of Dr. Maria Ogilvie Gordon. The description of the painting refers to the security of her recent marriage, but the fact that her husband's first wife died aged 28 reminds us that marriage and childbearing carried a risk for women. James Ogilvie died in 1942, so she was a widow at the age of 48. Again, marriage was no guarantee of lifelong security. Tragically, their son James died in action in 1944, less than 2 years after his father. Mrs. Ogilvy died in 1977, having outlived her husband by 35 years. Where did empowerment take women? Margaret Elizabeth Jemima Davidson, known as Magil, was born in Aberdeen in 1885. She attended Gray's School of Art, travelled and studied in Europe, and served as an ambulance driver during the First World War. In 1927 she founded Gushetnuke Pottery and ran it as a commercially successful pottery business. You will find examples of her pottery in Gallery 6 of the Art Gallery and elsewhere. This is the point of empowerment. Women no longer confined to one gallery, but out in the wider world. No longer sitting round the teacups, but, like Magil Davidson, creating them. Thank you for listening.